Today, we will be walking through four main objectives. We will begin with the making of the federal budget. We will then move to a discussion of key players in Congress and elsewhere. We will discuss how to follow the policymaking process. And finally, we will provide some suggestions for how you can join the policymaking conversation. So let's begin with the making of the federal budget. The congressional budget process requires participation from the executive federal agencies, the White House's Office of Management and Budget, and Congress working together to produce a budget for the upcoming fiscal year, which runs from October 1st through September 30th. Although in statute this is a straightforward process, in practice it is very complicated and can be confusing. But it is a process that government contractors should be familiar with in order to gain actionable insights and accurately forecast where there may be upcoming opportunities and other possible revenue streams, particularly within your customers of interest. Before we dive into it, we need to make sure that we're all talking about the same things. So probably the most important key term that is relevant to government contractors is going to be this idea of discretionary dollars. The overwhelming majority of federal spending consists of what they refer to as mandatory spending. These are things like Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. This also would include the interest on the national debt. The other category of funding, and what we are most interested in, is known as discretionary spending. These are programs that have annual allocations that provide a level of funding they may use within a given fiscal year, including dollars that are spent on government contracts. Now, understanding these discretionary dollars is critical because you need to know what is available to be spent within your target agencies. Congress each year through the budget process decides what federal agencies may spend their money on, and it tells us what products and services may be purchased in a given agency. In the end, it doesn't matter how good your offering is if there's no money available to use to purchase your service or product offering. This chart that you see here, the pie chart on the bottom left, gives you a breakout of where all this money goes. So you'll see mandatory spending and the interest payment on the debt are going to be a significant portion of the pie, with discretionary spending typically representing roughly 30%. Now, within discretionary spending, you'll see the breakout between defense discretionary and R&D, as well as non-defense discretionary and R&D. The Department of Defense typically spends more in a given year than all civilian agencies combined. So it's important to know how these dollars are distributed across the federal budget. The diagram that you see to the right is an abbreviated timeline of what the federal budget process looks like. So you'll see the executive branch process happening in the first half of the year, as well as the legislative process, which takes place in the second half of the year. It doesn't typically happen this way, even though it should, and I will discuss that momentarily. Now, there are technically 14 steps in the budget process timeline, laid out in statute as determined by the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. As I've mentioned, although this is what the process is supposed to look like, this is often not what it actually looks like. That said, let's walk through what it should look like. So from July to February, agencies are providing their requirements to the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. OMB is then sending back information to the federal agencies asking for revisions. That process goes back and forth a couple of times. This is known as passbacks. And then OMB compiles what they consider the final budget, and that president's budget request is submitted to Congress. From March to June, we then enter the legislative process, wherein both the Senate Budget Committee and the House Budget Committee are reviewing the PBR on their own. They will then come together to craft a budget resolution that meets the requirements of both chambers. Once that budget resolution has been agreed to, we then move into the Appropriations Subcommittee hearings and markups. Those happen concurrently. Once those processes have concluded, they review, approve, vote on the measures, and ultimately, once both chambers has passed those appropriations measures, then that moves to the president to sign into law. Now, let's break that out into its component parts. We'll start with these federal agency budget justifications. Federal agencies have been engaged in this budget planning process for at least 6 months before the submission, and oftentimes as much as 18 months before the fiscal year begins. They then submit those proposals to the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, to be reviewed. The president determines what the administration will support. Agency budget justifications include line items for every program that they would like to fund, as well as their thoughts on strategy and priorities for the upcoming fiscal year. OMB notifies the agency of what the president is thinking in terms of direction and funding amounts and sends that information back to the agencies through this process that I have mentioned called passbacks. This is not a one-time process. Most often, this typically happens 2 or 3 times where the agency and OMB go back and forth making adjustments based on both the agency's needs and the president's priorities. Finally, once they've incorporated those revisions, the final request is submitted to OMB, which is then compiled into the president's budget request that is sent to Congress. If we take a closer look at these, there's a lot of information that you can glean just within these federal agency budget justification documents. As I said, they are required to submit written justifications of their requests to the appropriations committees and subcommittees. Now, their justification includes a lot more information than what the president's budget request will include. So this is going to include things like previous accomplishments and funding priorities, a detailed description of each program activity and its purpose, how it's connected to the agency's mission, and written explanation of proposed changes for the next fiscal year. So that typically focuses on an increase or decrease in spending in a particular program, but it may include other information, the consolidation of programs, anything that will create a change in a previously funded program must be detailed here. This is extremely helpful when considering capture efforts because all of this information is publicly available. So you can take a look at these documents to get a sense of where the agency is headed in the coming fiscal year, what their priorities are, what programs they are looking to fund, what programs they are considering discontinuing. These are all valuable data points in your capture plan for your target agencies. Now, as I mentioned, all of those documents are then compiled into the president's budget request or the PBR. So this document is developed by OMB and approved by the president, and it has 3 key roles. Number 1, it's going to lay out for Congress what the president recommends for overall federal fiscal policy. It's going to lay out the president's priorities for federal programs, not just for the coming fiscal year, but typically 5 years or more into the future. Finally, it's also going to signal to Congress what spending and tax policy changes the president would like to see. This is not a promise that these changes will occur, but simply a signal to lawmakers that the president has these sorts of initiatives and priorities in mind. Within this document, which is publicly available, you will find first the budget of the US government, which includes a budget message summarizing his or her policy priorities. It will provide summary tables of the aggregate numbers, and then it will provide narrative descriptions of the proposed activities. This will also include historical tables that will look into the past, providing an overview of federal government finances, things like budget authority, government receipts and outlays, and the federal debt, which is becoming of increasing importance in the budget process. It will provide analytical perspectives on the PBR, a discussion of programs, the technical explanations of the budget baselines, all of the back-end information that gives Congress a little bit of insight into the process and how the budget was pulled together. And finally, you will find a whole host of appendices, including things like budget estimations, individual programs, recommended appropriations language. All of that is going to be included in the appendices. Now, as I mentioned, these are publicly available documents. You can find them typically on the White House website under the OMB webpage. It is usually front and center. You can also Google President's Budget Request fiscal year, insert fiscal year here, and it will come up as one of the top results on Google. So very easy to find and also very useful. Now, once that information has been submitted to Congress, we then move to the Congressional Budget Resolution. Typically, the budget resolution should be completed on or before April 15th. They very rarely meet that deadline. We don't anticipate meeting that deadline this year for fiscal year 25. Sometimes Congress does not pass a congressional budget resolution at all. So when that happens, we will then use the previous year's resolution, which is a multi-year plan, and the House and Senate may make changes to it. They'll adopt special procedures that allow them to fiddle with the spending levels that are laid out in the previous resolution without going through the full budget resolution creation process. This includes 19 broad spending categories. These are considered budget functions. If you're interested in this, this is sort of a deep dive topic. There is more information available out there on what this looks like. We won't dive into detail on those budget functions today. Now, importantly, I want to identify a couple of key terms that come up as part of the congressional budget resolution. First is going to be this difference between budget authority and outlays. So if you imagine budget authority as your household budget, it's the amount of money that is available to you in a given year. Outlays are what's actually spent. So budget authority is not a promise of dollars to an agency. It is instead a congressional ceiling on how much money an agency may receive in the appropriations process. This is a great example from an infrastructure activity. So if a bill appropriated $50 million for building a bridge, that would give $50 million in budget authority for the coming year. That is not a promise that outlays will actually reach $50 million that year. It may be the following year or a year later at the completion of the bridge. So this dynamic of what's available versus what is actually spent is important to keep track of in the budget process. I'll also note this 302 allocations report. This takes the spending totals that are laid out by budget function and then assigns them to congressional appropriations committees. Bills must fit within the 302A allocation that was given to them, as well as the committee determined 302B sub-allocation. So this is going to be within the larger appropriations committee for something like military construction and VA. They're going to have a series of subcommittees that are dealing more specifically with the component parts of that larger appropriation. That's going to be your 302B allocation. This is more so procedural versus actionable for industry, but it's just good to know that this is what Congress is doing internally once they've received the president's budget request. Now, I touched on this already, but this idea of authorization versus appropriation is very important. So actual funding, money that's deposited into the account, comes through the appropriations bills. These bills are passed based on both the president's recommendations and congressional priorities. This is where a lot of disagreement tends to happen. The chambers, often when led by different political parties, will disagree. The president's priorities may also not match what Congress is thinking. So there's a lot of back and forth in this process to determine how much money will actually be put into the coffers for agencies to use in a given fiscal year. Now, authorization measures, while setting the top line values, will also provide other things like policies, head counts, all sorts of additional pieces that are important as part of the process and also the larger functioning of the government. So you can use authorizations measures to create new departments and agencies, to create new programs, to set rules for how they're operated, to set, as I mentioned, those top line funding levels. All of this information is included in an authorization, but may not be included in an appropriations bill where the dollars are actually dispersed into an agency's account. Now, this table on the right lays out the 12 subcommittees that manage appropriations. These are meant to be standalone appropriations bills. More often than not, we see these passed as what is considered a minibus, so a combination of several, or an omnibus, which is one large appropriation that rolls all of these together into one. Now, key policy that you all should be aware of is going to be the National Defense Authorization Act. This is not a funding bill. This is a policy bill. It's important to know this distinction. The NDAA happens every year. It provides the authorization of appropriations for the Department of Defense, nuclear programs at the Department of Energy, and other defense-related activities. This does provide a top-line authorization for DoD funding. It also establishes things like defense policies and restrictions. It addresses organizational administrative matters related to DoD. And probably most importantly for industry, it includes a wide range of provisions that impact how industry is allowed to do business with the government and vice versa. More often than not, legislation that we see that affects rules and regulations in government contracting, things like accelerated payments for small businesses, the prohibition on certain Chinese IT usage in government contracts. All of those pieces came through as part of the NDAA. Now, this document started as a 1/2-page section of a larger bill that provided for shipbuilding and some additional procurement authorities for the Department of Defense. It is now a massive document. The 2023 NDAA was 4,400 pages. So there is a lot of information packed into this document. If you'd like to read it, I'm going to talk later on about how to find this sort of information publicly online. I myself do not read this in its entirety. I rely on others who have read it and provide summaries, but it is out there if you are interested. The graphic on the bottom right gives you an idea of what the process looks like. This is a really simplified view of it, but it operates similar to the congressional budget process without the components coming from OMB. This is typically a standalone process that happens in Congress. Again, this is something that happens every year. Sometimes it happens on time, sometimes it does not. So although statute has a clear direction for when and how these processes are supposed to take place, that's not typically how we see it happen in practice year to year. Other relevant documentation that's going to be useful, particularly if you are interested in doing business with the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense pushes out what is referred to as the Green Book. This is the National Defense Budget Estimate. This is a ton of information about programs. So program acquisition cost by weapons system, detailed budget justification documents, overview of the defense budget for the year. There is a ton of information in here. You will also find, if you're familiar with program element line items or PE line items, this information is detailed here and gives you an idea of how, for a specific weapons or other program, spending has changed over time and how it's projected into the future. The Department of Defense also develops what is known as the Future Years Defense Program, or the FYDP. The FYDP projects anticipated personnel, resource, and program needs in future years, typically looking 5 years out. These numbers are updated based on final PBR figures. This is not an irrelevant exercise. They will actually use this information when looking at budget justification documents in future years to see how well the department is doing planning. Now, I mentioned that this process almost never happens on time the way it's supposed to. What happens when the process goes haywire? You have probably heard the term continuing resolution on the news, in the trade press, shortened to be a CR. When the government has not passed appropriations bills by the start of the fiscal year on October 1, a continuing resolution is a stopgap measure that allows the government to continue operating. It avoids a shutdown until Congress is able to pass full year appropriations. Now, what happens under a CR is previous year funding levels remain in place. This also includes a provision on new starts, or the initiation of new activities that weren't funded in the previous year. So for some agencies, this can be really positive, particularly the civilian agencies who, depending on the congressional makeup, may be expecting significant cut to their budget. Staying at previous year's levels can be a good thing. This is particularly harmful, however, for agencies like the Department of Defense, where needs are rapidly evolving. They are unable to start new programs to meet emerging needs when under a CR. So this sort of stop and go methodology, this uncertainty, this is really harmful for a lot of agencies as well. Now, what this is meant to do is preserve Congress's prerogative to decide the fate of projects and programs in the specific agencies while they're still working on the full appropriations bills. CRs, however, are often leveraged politically, particularly in election years where they don't want to make decisions on the budget before the new Congress comes into place. You'll see a lot of CR activity. However, these really have just become part of the regular process. The last time Congress went through that process I've described in regular order and passed all their appropriations on time was in fiscal year 1997. So that would have been beginning October 1st of 1996. So it has been a very long time since we have started the fiscal year without even a single continuing resolution. To summarize, I'm going to walk through how money moves. So we talked about authorization. That's where ceilings are set for funding, conditions are put in place for policies, programs, et cetera, in the next year. We then move to appropriations. So this is the bank deposit. We have said, here's your budget, here's what you actually have. That money is now in your coffers to award as part of contracts and other activities. What we typically look at when we are tracking government spending is going to be an obligation. So this is when an agency has awarded a contract, industry is doing the work, an invoice has been submitted to the government for work completed, and that invoice has been approved. However, this is not the moment in which money is dispersed. That comes when we hit an outlay. So this is when the Treasury actually writes that check and pays the contractor for the work that has been submitted and approved. Outlays typically lag obligations. So in order to determine how money is moving over time, particularly in a given quarter or even a given month of the fiscal year, we focus instead on obligations to avoid the sorts of bureaucratic delays that can push outlays out into the future. Now that we've walked through what the budget process looks like and who all is involved in the budget process, let's talk about the key players in Congress and elsewhere in the government that influence this process. Now, there are several committees that you should know, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. So before any legislation can be voted on by the full Senate or House, it has to first be reviewed and passed in committee. And legislation impacting government contracting really can come from anywhere. However, these are the most likely places that you're going to find things that actually affect your business, in addition to the NDAA that we talked about previously. So on the House side, it's going to be the House Armed Services Committee, or the HASC. You'll see the House Committee on Small Business pushing out legislation. You will see the House Appropriations Committee. The Committee on Homeland Security will push out relevant information. The Budget Committee, and apologies, the Appropriations Committee is listed there twice, but to underline its importance, that's where the money actually comes from. So we really pay close attention to what's happening in the Appropriations Committee. On the Senate side, very similar, the Senate Armed Services Committee, or the SASC, the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, commonly referred to as the HISGAC, their Committee on Appropriations, the Committee on Finance within the Senate, and the Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. These are all places that you're likely to see legislation coming out of that affects how you're able to do business with the federal government. But I will underscore that these are not the only places that that legislation can come from. So having a good understanding of congress.gov, which I will walk through in the next module, is very helpful to find legislation that is coming out of other places across Congress. In addition to what's happening in Congress, industry should also be paying close attention to the FAR Council and the Federal Register. You should be familiar with the FAR. If you're not, I would encourage you to look at our Government Contracting 101 webinar series. The FAR provides all of the legal language that underpins contracts. Now, when looking at the FAR, this is a very robust document. It includes a lot of legalese. It can be kind of hard to understand. However, it is important to know the role that the FAR plays in your contracts and how you're awarded contracts, how you are allowed to bid on contracts, all of those activities that we are all participating in regularly. So the FAR Council has the regulatory authority over these rules and procedures. Oftentimes we will see legislation coming out of Congress that directs the FAR Council to institute a certain kind of rule. Anytime a new rule is proposed or implemented, it then is posted to the Federal Register. So within the Federal Register, you can find past and present rules. You can also find requests for comments on proposed rules. So this is really important. Anytime the FAR Council has a proposed rule that it would like to institute for government contracting, it has to first be available for public comment for industry to say, hey, this is what the language says, but this is what this means for us in actuality. So this is a wealth of information. You can also, using acquisition.gov, take a look at individual FAR provisions to better understand the provisions that you're seeing showing up in your contracts and how they're used and how they interact with one another. Another great resource full of information is going to be the Congressional Budget Office. Although it is tied to Congress, this is a nonpartisan, apolitical office that does economic analyses on legislation that is proposed or passed out of Congress. So they are looking at hundreds of proposed legislations every year. What they are working to do is project the future cost of that legislation and the potential cost savings that may be associated with it. Their analysis is considered objective. It uses economic and other indicators to understand the impact from a fiscal perspective of the activities that Congress is undertaking. These reports can be really valuable when you're thinking long-term about where the market is headed. This diagram you see here comes directly from CBO. They call this their 4-step process for preparing those cost estimates. All of these reports are publicly available. I'm going to show you how to find those as well. So let's move into finding that information. You can get a lot of value out of congress.gov. I will be upfront and say that this website is kind of clunky. It can be hard to navigate, but there are several things you can do to make it more useful and a little easier to navigate. Now, when you open up congress.gov, this is what the page will look like. If you're looking for something specific, there's a good way to search for it. First, you want to put in current Congress. So if you type in something in the search box and do not limit for current Congress, it will pull up anything in the last several decades that includes that language or even pulls a little bit of that language. It makes the search results really unwieldy. So please, please, please start by filtering for current Congress. You can then include the name of the bill, the colloquial reference for it, a description of the bill. You can use any of those in the search box to get to what you're looking for. If you are not looking for anything specific and are interested perhaps in just what's going on now, you'll see on the left-hand side a list of most viewed bills. Typically, it will display 3. You can then click to see the top 10. This will tend to vary throughout the year based on what is happening. If there's a lot of budget activity going on, typically those are the bills you'll see there at the top. If there's something that you're seeing a lot in the news, that will also show up as one of the most viewed bills. In addition, on the right-hand side under the search bar, you can see an appropriations status table. So this will give you a breakout of those 12 appropriations bills that I mentioned previously and tell you where they are at in the process with each of them. Now, once you have conducted that search, it's going to pull up all of the things that have relevant language from the search terms that you have provided. This can be daunting. This can also be really useful. First, I would encourage you to go over to the left-hand side and select only legislation, unless you are looking at committee reports, which typically those folks who are using things like committee reports and meetings are really well versed in Congress. So they're looking for something really specific. For most of us, we really only care about legislation. So I will go over there and I will turn off everything except legislation to whittle down those search results a little further. Now, what you're going to get here is going to be a wide range of things that have been flagged based on the language that you've input into the search. So you'll notice that although I input National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2024, that is not one of the top 3 options that comes up. So this is a great way to identify related bills, but it can also be kind of frustrating because you can't see exactly what you're looking for right off the bat oftentimes. What this has also pulled, however, is going to be the Intelligence Authorization Act, the Military Construction Authorization Act. So we talked about that dynamic between authorizations and appropriations. This is a good way to find related legislation that you're not necessarily paying attention to. So once you open a piece of legislation, I've here gone into the Military Construction Act for fiscal year 2024. There's a lot of information that's going to then become available to you. So this box at the top left is going to provide a summary. It will tell you who in Congress is sponsoring the bill, what committee is responsible for it, what committee meetings it has been discussed at, as well as the committee reports on that bill. And then it's going to give you the latest action and an action tracker. So this gives you a good sneak peek at who's involved, what's been happening, and where the bill is at. You'll see here this tracker has not had any information input into it. So typically what this means is that the bill has been introduced and referred to committee, and the committee is now undertaking its process. If available, you will also see a CBO cost estimate link. So this is where those reports that I mentioned talking about CBO are easily linked and available for you to take a look at. This can be really interesting, particularly for things like authorizations and appropriations, to get a picture of what the long-term financial implications of the legislation are. All of this publicly linked, publicly available. There's no firewalls. You don't need to create accounts. This is all available to you at any time. Now, other things that are available when you're looking at a piece of legislation on congress.gov. That first tab is going to be text. That is going to give you the full text of the legislation. If you would like to read it start to finish, you can do that. There's an option to listen to it. Most often, what I'm doing here is searching for a keyword because there's something in particular that I am interested in. So if I'm looking at appropriations and I would like to know what the authorized end strength for active duty Marines is, I will keyword search that within this text field, but you do have the option to look at the full text of the bill. The next tab, the Actions tab, will give you a list of all the related actions for this piece of legislation. That includes things like amendments, referral to committee, and even votes on the legislation. So on the left, you can filter to see what's been happening based on the criteria that they've laid out. So if you're really interested in actions, except amendments, you're not really worried about amendments, you can filter those out. If it's a bill that has been in both the House and the Senate, you can filter to see only activities in one chamber or the other. You can take a look at just committee activities. Lots of ways to slice and dice this information to see what's been happening beyond just that little tracker that I showed you on the first page. On the Titles tab, this is really useful, particularly when you're seeing legislation in trade press. It's going to give you more information about how the bill is being referred to. So it's going to list other commonly used names for the legislation beyond the long full form title. Now, what do you do with all this information? Because there's a lot of information out there. I will start with the disclaimer that congress.gov often lags what is actually happening by usually sometimes as much as a week or two. Sometimes it's up to date right off the bat, but it really is a toss up depending on how that information is being input. But you might consider creating your own policy tracker. This is a really good way to make sense of the congressional information that is most relevant to your business and the agencies that you work with. Particularly, even when we think about things like size standards, if you are a small business, you may be less concerned about legislation that only impacts the very large platform integrator type companies. Vice versa, if you're a large business, you may not be as concerned about things like small business legislation. This does not have to be a complex document. So what I've provided here is a screenshot of my own legislation tracker that I use internally. Doesn't include much. It has the bill number, the title, a description of what's in it, the status of it, and then every time I update this tracker, I just mark in the action whether or not something has changed. So has that bill now been passed out of committee since the last time I looked? Is it newly introduced? Is it sitting stagnant? And then I just keep a date at the top that says this is when this was last updated. There's no need to get bogged down in the nuance of this information. You can make it as simple or complex as you like. If there are folks in Congress that you are interested in building relationships with, you can tag them as a sponsor so you can see what they're up to. You can add and take away information as it's relevant, but the most important thing is that this be digestible and easily used. Finally, now that we've seen how the process works, who's involved in the process, what can you do from the industry side to join the conversation and be involved in the policymaking process? If you take away nothing else from this training, I want you to take away the importance of letting your voice be heard and participating in this process. Oftentimes, we find that legislation coming out of Congress is disconnected from what the realities of industry are. Many times these folks really don't know what the practical implications of their legislative language may be. This is where you come in. So first, consider responding to requests for comments on proposed rules that you see in the Federal Register. If there is a rule on small business payments that will actually make it harder for you as a small business to maintain appropriate cash flow, let them know that. You can participate in industry groups like the Professional Services Council and the National Defense Industrial Association. These are places where you can have your voice shared, and you can also give that voice to government under the cover of these larger associations. So we find this often is a preferred solution when folks don't want to anger a government contractor or engage directly with Congress themselves. They will participate in places like PSC and NDAA to make sure that their comments are getting submitted and shared without having to tie their name to them. If you're not worried about that, you can go straight to your congressional representatives about issues that matter to you, particularly in the DC metro area, but elsewhere in the country as well. Congressional representatives are especially interested in how legislation is impacting businesses and government contractors and the folks that directly support the government's mission. So you can reach out to those folks to let them know your thoughts on a particular piece of legislation or how the process is going. Finally, you can seek opportunities to testify in congressional hearings. Oftentimes, this happens through a lobbying group or one of these professional industry groups. If that's something you're interested in, let folks know. They're looking for personal stories to take to Congress to really highlight the real world implications of the work that Congress is doing. All of this to say, there's no right way to contribute to the policy process. We just encourage you to use your voice and really be active as these things are under consideration so that what eventually comes out as a final rule in the FAR or as a legal requirement passed by Congress is reflective of the challenges the industry has and works to address some of those things. That is the conclusion of this training on leveraging policy information in government contracting. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're interested in more content like this, I mentioned the Government Contracting 101 training previously. All of that is available at thepulsegovcon.com. We are also happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you so much for tuning in.